Life in Strahlia. Someone recently asked me via LinkedIn what it was like to live in Australia or Australia. Is that different? Australia or Australia? Australia. It's a very difficult question to answer. It's like one thing for me, but like something else for someone else. It's undoubtedly different living in Melbourne or Sydney than it is living in Cairns. It's different living here than living one suburb over. There's no single way of living in Australia that sets it off from other parts of the world. At least I don't think so. Maybe there is. I don't in any way consider myself to be a typical Aussie. I'm not really a typical anything, I think. In many ways, I'm extremely atypical. But I'm also conscious that types tend to be cliches anyway, and that probably no one is really a typical Australian. I wasn't born here, as many people of my generation weren't. I'm one of those pommy migrants. That refers to someone who came from the UK. A great many of us arrived in the 1950s and 1960s, but I've lived here most of my life since 1966 when I was 8 years old. My 11-year-old granddaughter recently had a school project in which she had to interview a relative who had migrated to Australia from another country, or who perhaps their parents had done so. Her questions were very interesting and really got me thinking. In many ways, life here was very different from life in the UK back in the mid-1960s, and in many ways not so very different. My parents brought a lot of the UK with them and held on to it for many, many years afterwards. My mother, who is now 97, probably still holds on to many of those Britishisms. There are, of course, images from TV and cinema that you might have seen. Do you see many or any Australian TV shows or movies where you live? I know that a lot of Australian actors are in American TV shows and American movies, and you may not even know that many of them are Australian because they adopt American accents. Are you aware of the Australian soapies, especially shows such as Home and Away? I haven't watched Home and Away since my children were quite young, though I do see trailers for it quite often. But the fact that it's set in a place called Summer Bay, and that in fact it always seems to be summer, does it ever rain there? This is bound to give a somewhat skewed impression to the rest of the world. Not everyone, young or old, spends every available moment at the beach surfing. Personally, I hate the beach. It's one of the last places I ever want to be. Then there are the Crocodile Dundees, Paul Hogan, and the Croc Hunter, Steve Irwin. Caricatures that seem to have much broader appeal overseas than they do here. I may be wrong about this, but my impression is that Steve Irwin was, and Bindi Irwin, his daughter, is far more popular overseas than here in Australia. Just to set the record straight, most of us don't go around wrestling crocodiles or capturing highly venomous snakes. Another image of Australia is that we're heavy drinkers. Perhaps we are. But so are many people in other Western nations. According to World Health Organization data, based on per capita drinking, Australia is ranked around 18th in the world, although we're ranked well above other countries that might be considered culturally similar to us, such as the UK, New Zealand, the USA, and Canada. Another image is of our sporting prowess. I think it's probably fair to say that in many sports we rank much higher than our population would predict. Our medal tally at the Olympics, let's pretend the 2012 Olympics didn't happen, our medal tally is usually disproportionately high. So yes, sport has a very important place in our culture. Is it more so than in other countries though? I'm not so sure. In other areas we've been very fortunate in the past, areas such as healthcare, education, personal freedom, economic prosperity, national security. My impression is, though, that in many of these areas we're rapidly falling back towards the field. While many other nations may continue to look with envy at Australia, I think overseas perceptions are lagging somewhat behind the reality. perhaps our own perceptions too. A nation often clings desperately to its self-image, an image from the past, long after that image has ceased to be reflected in present reality. I think that's probably true of Great Britain, for instance, and even, dare I say, the USA. Most of the time, day-to-day life, even here in far north Queensland in tropical Cairns, nestled between World Heritage rainforests on the one hand and the Great Barrier Reef on the other, even here life is pretty much the same as in most other Western nations. Most of us live in cities or suburbs, and that's perhaps even more true of Australia than other countries. We work, we eat, we sleep, and then we work again. Despite Summer Bay, life here is not a perpetual holiday. Look, if any of you have any questions about life in Australia, or even life up here in the Australian tropics, I'll be glad to try and answer them if I can, though I may not be able to. Pop your questions in the comments. I'd also be interested to hear about any impressions you might have about our land down under, and I'll maybe respond to them.